Welcome to History Rewritten. Tonight, we examine the deepest fracture point of the 20th century, a single, desperate night in July 1918, and imagine a world where the outcome was fundamentally different. The historical truth is grim. 304 years of Romanov rule culminated in tragedy, weakness, and disaster. Russia's catastrophic involvement in World War I exposed existing economic and political weaknesses. Tsar Nicholas II's leadership proved fatally ineffective, sealing his dynasty's fate. Yet, if that fateful night in Yekaterinburg had played out differently, if the Tsar and his family Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and young Alexei had found a way to freedom, the map of the world would look unrecognizable today. Imagine not the monolithic authoritarian Soviet Union, but the Russian constitutional monarchy, a stable, federated power anchored in the agrarian heartland. A world without the Iron Curtain where Berlin remains unified and Eastern Europe avoids decades of ideological subjugation. There is no ideological Cold War, but a return to traditional great power competition, fought not over communism versus capitalism, but spheres of influence and raw resources. The greatest ideological competitor to the West never existed. But to understand how such a radical divergence could occur, we must first examine the brittle structure of the historical moment that gave rise to Bolshevism. If you're enjoying what we're creating, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It helps us out more than you can possibly imagine. The Romanov Dynasty collapsed in March 1917 during the spontaneous protests of the February Revolution. Nicholas II's decision to continue Russia's participation in World War I was a death blow. The war intensified nationwide discontent, triggering massive riots and mutiny among the troops in Petrograd. Under pressure from his generals, Nicholas abdicated the throne for himself and his son, ending centuries of autocratic rule. The void left by the Tsar was filled by the Provisional Government, a liberal and moderate socialist alliance that quickly proved inept. Their fundamental error was refusing to withdraw Russia from the punishing war, failing to address the primary cause of popular suffering. This fatal flaw was compounded by the Kornilov affair in September 1917, a failed military coup that destroyed the provisional government's credibility. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky, in response to the coup attempt, alienated the military conservatives and was forced to rely momentarily on radical left-wing elements for defense. The incident shattered the fragile alliance between civilian and military leadership. By October 1917, the provisional government commanded neither the loyalty of the army nor the support of the Petrograd Soviet, leaving the path clear for the well-organized Bolshevik faction. The Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917, the October Revolution, was not a democratic mandate, it was a coup d'etat. The true threat to Lenin's power emerged immediately afterward in the elections for the All-Russian Constituent Assembly. This body, intended to define Russia's new constitutional future, was overwhelmingly dominated not by Bolsheviks, who won only 183 seats, but by the agrarian-focused Socialist Revolutionary Party, SRS, who commanded 324 seats. The SRS represented the vast peasant majority and campaigned on the platform of land socialization, redistributing aristocratic estates to the common people. If this democratically elected, peasant-backed government had been allowed to survive and implement these popular reforms, it would have immediately co-opted the most potent demands leveraged by the Bolsheviks, securing genuine popular support and marginalizing Lenin's regime. The Bolshevik response was swift and definitive. They forcibly dissolved the Constituent Assembly after it met for just 13 hours in January 1918, proclaiming the Congress of Soviets as the new governing body. This singular act extinguished the possibility of a non-communist, democratic, socialist Russia, leading directly to the brutal Civil War, 1918 to 1921. It was during this conflict that the fate of the Romanovs became a strategic matter. Imprisoned first in the Alexander Palace, then Tobolsk, the imperial family was eventually moved to the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, as anti-Bolshevik White Army forces, including the Czechoslovak Legion, approached the city, the Bolshevik revolutionaries executed the entire family and their retainers. This calculated act of regicide was not merely personal revenge. It was a political maneuver designed to prevent the Tsar from becoming a unifying symbol for the counter-revolutionary white cause. The murder removed the last monarchical challenge and solidified the Bolshevik path toward total ideological state control, the Soviet Union. But what if the outcome of that single night was reversed? The historical record confirms that the execution was driven by the desire to eliminate a figurehead for the anti-Bolshevik coalition. Therefore, our divergence pivots on a highly coordinated intelligence operation, perhaps involving British diplomats or elements of the advancing white forces, successfully extracting the Romanovs from Yekaterinburg and spiriting them to safety in exile before July 1918. Their survival, particularly that of the young Tsarevich Alexei, suffering from hemophilia, transforms the Civil War. They become potent, symbolic refugees. The monarchist white generals and the massively popular socialist revolutionaries, the forces that historically hated each other, find a common, unifying figure in the young Tsarevich. The moderate anti-Bolshevik coalition, now fielding both a legitimate symbolic head of state and a democratically elected mandate via the surviving members of the Constituent Assembly, gains the critical edge in momentum and popular mobilization. The white forces, though often incompetent historically, now have the political legitimacy needed to rally the vast peasantry who remain primarily loyal to the SR promise of land reform. By 1921, the Bolsheviks are contained and defeated. The new state that rises from the ashes of the Civil War is not the USSR, but the Russian Constitutional Monarchy, RCM. Crucially, this is not a return to failed autocracy. The new government is a pragmatic compromise reflecting the victorious forces, a parliamentary democracy anchored by the SR majority. The Romanovs return not as autocratic rulers but as hereditary, symbolic heads of state, much like the European models in Belgium or Sweden. They unify the nation, performing civic and representative roles, while executive and policy-making power rests firmly with the Duma and the cabinet led by moderate socialists. The RCM's immediate focus is the national consolidation and economic recovery. The SRS implement the core of their program, the socialization and redistribution of land to the peasants. This agrarian reform avoids the forced collectivization and catastrophic famines associated with Stalin's rule. Russia develops a mixed economy based on cooperative agriculture and gradual decentralized industrialization, integrating economically with Western Europe rather than retreating behind a self-imposed ideological wall. This stable, non-ideological Russia becomes a vital, if cautious, player on the international stage throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The greatest consequence of the Romanov divergence is the fundamental restructuring of World War II. Historically, the Eastern Front was the most gruesome and destructive theater of modern history. It was the grinder that consumed the vast majority of German strength, diverting manpower and resources that would have otherwise overwhelmed the Western Allies. By 1944 and 1945, Germany committed between 60% and 66% of its standing army to fighting the Soviet Union. The staggering casualties, over 4 million Germans dying in the East, were multiples higher than on the Western Front. In our alternative reality, the stable, non-ideological RCM is, at minimum, a neutral power. Adolf Hitler lacks the ideological pretext, the fight against Judeo-Bolshevism, and the strategic necessity to invade Russia in 1941. With the Eastern Front eliminated, 100% of the German war machine, millions of troops, thousands of aircraft, and critical armored divisions are concentrated on the West and the Mediterranean. This concentration dramatically alters the European war. The massive diversion of German air and naval assets means the Battle of Britain is far more intense, potentially enabling Germany to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. U-boat warfare is intensified, placing enormous strain on Allied supply lines. Resources are heavily directed toward reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, making any cross-channel invasion by the Allies, such as D-Day, a significantly bloodier, more formidable challenge. The immense burden of conventional warfare, previously borne by the Soviet Union, is shifted entirely onto British and American ground forces. The eventual Allied victory, achieved through the overwhelming industrial output of the United States and the United Kingdom, is secured, but likely pushed back, perhaps to 1946 or 1947, and purchased at a much steeper price for the Western powers. The absence of the Soviet Union fundamentally changes the post-1945 world. The entire doctrine of global politics, centered around the conflict between the United States and the USSR, known as the Cold War, simply vanishes. The U.S. policy of containment, the arms race, and the fear of mutually assured destruction never define the post-war era. The vacuum left by ideological bipolarity is filled by a return to multipolarity, the great power politics of the 19th century. Geopolitical rivalry focuses on traditional spheres of influence, military balance, and economic control, rather than the spread of competing state systems. The fate of Europe is the most striking difference. The Iron Curtain, the division of Germany, and the Berlin Crisis were direct consequences of Soviet occupation of Eastern territories following their push westward. In the ATL, without Soviet armies, Germany is occupied solely by the Western Allies. It rapidly unifies as a democratic state, avoiding the trauma of division. Furthermore, Eastern European nations establish sovereign governments, free from Soviet influence. NATO, created explicitly to counter Soviet expansion, would either be unnecessary or function as a much looser, traditional alliance to balance against potential Russian, RCM, or German resurgence. Global proxy conflicts still occur, notably the inevitable wars of decolonization in Asia and Africa. However, the motivation for American intervention changes completely. Coups and regional wars in Latin America and Asia are no longer framed as containing communism, but as protecting strategic interests, resource access, and American businesses. The ideological element is stripped away, revealing pure economic and strategic competition. Finally, the elimination of the U.S.-Soviet arms and space races removes the intense pressure for accelerated technological development. Much of the breakthrough innovation in rocketry, computing, and communications that defined the late 20th century was subsidized and driven by the urgent need to outpace a global enemy. Without the threat of annihilation, progress may have proceeded at a more gradual, market-driven pace, potentially delaying the advent of technologies we take for granted today. The murder of the Romanov family in July 1918 was more than a personal tragedy. It was the strategic act that cleared the field for a unique and violent ideological state, the USSR. That single night launched the world on a trajectory toward 70 years of bipolar ideological conflict and unprecedented proxy wars. The survival of the Romanovs, while not a guarantor of peace or perfection, served as the necessary symbolic pivot for moderate forces in Russia. It allowed the socialist revolutionary program, the land reform sought by the vast Russian peasantry, to define the nation's future, resulting in a stable, federated constitutional state integrated with the Western world. In this alternative history, a unified, constitutional Russia fundamentally alters the strategic balance of power in two world wars, prevents the geopolitical fracture of the Cold War, and allows the 20th century to unfold under the old rules of great power competition, avoiding the existential threat that defined our historical reality. The choice made that Dark Knight was truly the choice between two very different centuries. This has been History Rewritten. I'm your host, exploring the pivotal moments that shaped our world and the paths that might have led elsewhere.